and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm here to look back at Newcastle United's FA Cup victory on penalties over Blackburn Rovers at Ewood Park, but really look at how difficult a night it was for Newcastle, because it was a very passive, frustratingly slow performance from Eddie Howe's side again, which has kind of been a theme for much of the season, or much of the last couple of months at least. Blackburn were incredibly unlucky not to go through. Newcastle did have chances to put the game to bed and missed them before. They took the lead through Anthony Gordon, were pegged back by Sammy Smodics, and Martin Dubravka, the hero in the penalty shootout, to take Newcastle through to the quarterfinals. Is the first time since Sir Bobby Robson's era that Newcastle have been in the quarterfinals of both domestic cup competitions. We're a game from Wembley now, which is quite amazing, but there's a lot of problems that need to be discussed. I think it was a poor performance, as I mentioned, and I think Blackburn can feel a little bit hard done by in terms of their energy levels, their desire to win, John Eustace's tactics, Sammy Smodics' threat up front. Everything was sort of there on point for them. Newcastle did have, as I say, chances to win it through Anthony Gordon, Bruno Guimaraes, Harvey Barnes off the bench, but they just squandered them too often and, let the game at key points really pass them by for long spells. Not a great night, and we'll get into a little bit as to why that was, perhaps, and maybe a few thoughts about the sort of general place of where Newcastle are going into this Wolves game. Still a massive positive that they are where they are. They've still got a huge thing to look forward to, and obviously, as I say, one game from Wembley, that's massive for what could be, this has been a difficult season, but there's still a huge chance to make it probably the most memorable for for 2 or 3 generations now. I mentioned in the preview video for this game that if Newcastle lost the game, there would be questions asked, and I think that's still the case because of the performance. They got away with it last night, absolutely. For there's no arguing with that. I think Newcastle aren't what they say they are anymore. They're not intense. Intensity was their identity last year. It was written on the training ground. Eddie Howe said that was the thing that you would get from Newcastle last season, and you did. They lost 3-0 at Aston Villa in April, and then the week later they absolutely blitzed Tottenham at home 6-1, 5 goals in the first 21 minutes, as everyone remembers. This season, it's just been completely different. They've just been so slow and so passive that I sort of think that it isn't deliberate, and I think there's a bit of a paradox with Eddie Howe in terms of a contradiction, in that he talks about intensity being the way he wants to play, and he talks about the way that he sees his team being, and that was all that they were last season. But then he also says that the characteristics of the team are made up by individuals. That was a question specifically asked in his presser about the lack of aggression, and as I mentioned in the previous video, they're not Eddie Howe's shithousing mags, in inverted commas, anymore. Why isn't that? And he said, well, it's because the players who are out, they are the ones who have dictated that. He didn't mention names, but it's quite clear that Joe Linton's being missing for so many weeks now, and more weeks to come, that Newcastle haven't had that edge and haven't had that aggression and intensity in the same way that Joe Willock's missing hasn't allowed them to be as powerful going forward. So if intensity is the identity, why is it that it relies so heavily on individuals, when also at the same time the team plays like they want to be intense and powerful and pushing forward without those players? Those players, as I've mentioned on this channel before, are the reason why Newcastle were so good to play and difficult to play against. Without them, you've got to change the system, because Sean Longstaff, Louis Miley are very good at keeping things ticking over, very good at getting around the pitch, very good at positional play, but they're not powerful, driving forward, big forces of nature in the way that Joe Linton and Willock are. So without those players, and they haven't been together for months, you have to change the system. It won't be a surprise to anyone that I'm putting that down to be the reason why Newcastle are struggling so much, because we've been here before in these videos. I've spoken about the issue of Dan Burn emanating from midfield, but it's a paradox. Eddie Howe talks about intensity and talks about the way he wants to play, but then relies so heavily on 2 individuals to be there to do it, but also at the same time won't then change his way of playing. And he was asked about a possible system change, denied that as well. So the questions that are coming through are not about Eddie Howe's future. They're not about whether he deserves a chance to turn it round, because the obvious thing is that he does. He has worked miracles at Newcastle in this first 18 months. He's now going through a little bit of a tough spell, deserves the opportunity to turn that round, will get that opportunity crucially as well because the ownership really backs him and he deserves that. But the difference between now and the Q&A video I did in December, the questions are now at least starting to be asked. There's a bit of a shift where people are starting to go, well, you know, is it a guarantee that Eddie Howe can turn it around? Because the team is not playing the way he wants, and they haven't played like that for months. They've been passive. They've been too slow. They're nothing like they were, and that sort of last season there was always a sense that it would all be all right eventually, if even in the difficult moments, because the system was so strong, the players were so driven in the same way, everything was on the same page. Now it feels like the team has lost that identity a little bit, and Eddie Howe has refused to, has not changed it and not realised that he needs to find a new one when Joe Willock and Joe Linton aren't there. And I think, funnily enough, there was a way of finding that at Aston Villa, because Newcastle went there, were disciplined in midfield, well driven in terms of positional play. Miley, Longstaff and Bruno were fantastic that evening. Bruno was particularly good in his sort of disciplined role. Why couldn't Newcastle be more like that going forward than they have been? It's very, very strange that they've decided to continue in this way of trying to be open in midfield, and that's just allowed more and more players to run through the middle of them. That's what Blackburn did in the first half. Szmodics was a really, really interesting player to watch because he's a poacher in terms of nature. He reacts very well in the box. That's how he got his equaliser, and that's how he's got plenty of his 24 goals this season in the FA Cup and the Championship. He's the top scorer in the Championship because he's very, very good in the box. But he also plays more like a number 10 in a sort of deeper lying role off Sam Gallagher. That's what he did last night, and he picked up a lot of key spaces in between the two lines and made Newcastle pay when it mattered. There were obviously individual mistakes, like I think Harvey Barnes had a really difficult evening overall, and it was very obvious that, to me, and a bit similar to the Kieran Trippier penalty in the Carabao Cup quarterfinal against Chelsea, it felt like he was going to miss because he was lacking so much confidence after such a difficult introduction to the game. And Jamal Lascelles has obviously made that mistake as well, leading to the goal. But this isn't an individual situation. This is the whole team was really off it last night. I think Newcastle were saved a little bit by Bruno stepping up as the game went on, as he always does. Dubravka obviously making a string of good saves in the game, and then obviously being the hero in the penalty shootout, and then obviously Anthony Gordon scoring the goal, but also being the most creative player on the pitch. I think Livramento deserves a shout as well for being very similar in that regard. But there's just a lot of problems with Newcastle going forward that need to be addressed, but we're sat here saying the same thing over and over again. And the big thing I'm taking from this game is that Newcastle are in a position where you can't guarantee that they're going to come out of it because it's been too long. They don't have that identity of being aggressive and winning the ball high, and it's not happening anymore because they're just not that proactive. They're not that energetic, and it's hard now. For long periods there was an excuse about fatigue and an excuse about fitness and an excuse about number of games played. None of those things were an issue anymore. The squad was very strong again last night. The squad was extremely strong against Arsenal, mostly senior players in and around the team now, as I've mentioned, and the games are coming the same rate that they would normally for a team that's not in Europe anymore. So those things, we were supposed to be in a position where Newcastle were going to grow and change, and these things weren't going to be a problem from January onwards. And yet it's the end of February, nearly March, and we're still talking about them. That causes a little bit of a problem in terms of going forward. It doesn't mean that Eddie Howe is under pressure. It doesn't mean he deserves to be questioned in terms of his future, but he does deserve to be questioned in terms of his tactics and the way he's approaching this, because, as I say, there's a little bit of a contradiction in that he talks about intensity, he talks about wanting last season, all throughout the season, he was talking about those being the core principles, those being the driving forces. But actually, what I've seen this season is that really the individuals are what's dictating how Newcastle play. And without Joe Linton and Willock together, Newcastle can't be as intense. And that's obviously true. Obviously, that's fine. You know, you can't blame Eddie Howe for those players missing. But what you can do is then ask Eddie Howe to jig the system, rejig the way, the emphasis of the team. He hasn't done that, and I think that is why Newcastle are continuously now having these issues with intensity and being far too open, because there's a massive contradiction there. I'll be back on Friday to look ahead to Wolverhampton Wanderers at home. Thank you very much for joining me. Please like, share and subscribe if this is what you like, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.